Even though the government and the Bank of Canada have not quite come out and said it, newsflash, Canada is in fact in a recession. And as Canada quietly slips into a recession, the question is, what impact will this have on the Toronto real estate market? At a time where there are over 2,800 freeholds sitting on the market and 6,000 plus condos for sale, with months of inventory piling up. Question is, where do we go from here? Thank you so much for joining in today. My name is Ralph Fox, and I am the co-founder and broker of record of Fox Marin Associates. We're a boutique residential real estate brokerage located right here in downtown Toronto. Please be sure to smash that subscribe button. And if you have any constructive comments, we'd absolutely love to hear from you. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's talk about GDP. Statistics Canada recently came out and projected that the economy was set to shrink by 0.1% in the third quarter of 2023. Now, given that it's already shrunk by 0.2% last quarter, that means that we've had 6 months consecutive of negative growth. And that is the generally accepted definition of a recession. Although the government hasn't come out and called it, I'm calling it right now. We clearly are in a recession and heading into probably deeper waters over the next few months. So even more concerning than when looking at the GDP numbers are GDP per capita. And that's much more telling stat because it's not being masked by immigration with the population increasing of 1 million people per year. Canada's individual share of the economic pie has continued to shrink. National Bank of Canada noted that in the third quarter of 2023, GDP per capita actually shrunk by 2.4% as compared to the year prior. So this has been on decline for the last 2 years, and we're seeing a continued downward trend as Canadians per capita are actually getting poorer. Now, even more concerning than both of these stats is we're seeing consumer confidence down 3% to its lowest point since 1980. Now, it's very interesting to note that when COVID hit, we had a huge buildup of savings of households of Canadians totaling over $160 billion. That's now close to zero. So the buffer that was protecting Canadian households has basically been eviscerated in this high interest rate environment. And then, of course, there's an unemployment, and we've seen that tick up 0.7%. But when you actually start to take a deeper dive into the numbers, what you're going to see is that we created in Canada 40,000 new jobs every single month on average in 2023. However, the working age population due to immigration has surged by 78,000 people per month. So we're falling behind on a monthly basis, almost twice the average increase in employment according to Statistics Canada. So this means that in the first 8 months of 2023, Canada added 320,000 jobs, but also added 624,000 people potentially looking for work. With population growth outperforming or outpacing population gains, the employment rate is continuing to edge lower. So that's something definitely to keep your eye on. But as we see GDP falling, as we see per capita GDP falling, we're seeing consumer confidence becoming a real issue. Excess of housing, excess of savings per household is really starting to come down as well, basically to zero. And now we're seeing job growth or unemployment actually starting to tick up. So we're definitely here, and hopefully it's not going to be too deep or last too long. And I think that's one of the reasons why all of the big banks are calling for interest rates to start to come down by mid-2024. Lot to think about, but we're definitely in a recession regardless of what anyone is saying. It's here. And we now have to sort of unpack what this could mean in relation to the Bank of Canada, in relation to the Toronto real estate market overall. So we essentially are in a recession right now. And while we're in this recession, we're still seeing inflation as per the numbers put out by Stats Canada, which I always take with a grain of salt, but it's still showing that we're stubbornly at that 3.7% range when essentially the target is between 2 to 3. So it's really important to understand that statistics have shown, if they've looked at every recession basically in the last 100 years, that it takes on average about 22 months from the time of the first rate increase until a recession is entered into. And we are hitting that timeline. I think we're at about 20 months now since the first interest rate increase. So what we're looking at is it's still really working its way through the system, all this fiscal tightening, and it hasn't really felt its full impact on the economy, but we're definitely starting to feel it, and people are definitely starting to experience it in their pocketbooks. So as it works its way through the system, it's really expected as we end up deeper into a recession that rates and inflation will start to come down starting mid to early 2024. The other thing to keep on the radar here is there's a massive wall of mortgage renewals coming in 2025. And I don't think the Bank of Canada wants to be at an environment where rates are this elevated when we have all of this massive onslaught of renewals coming down the pipeline. And it looks like they're trying to get ahead of things by being more on the aggressive side. And it's really important to look at what the Bank of Canada is doing, because clearly they are taking the posturing, like a lot of central banks right now, that they would rather overshoot than undershoot. And if they had a choice between inflation and recession, I think most of the central banks, Canada included, would far prefer to take a recession. And so there are two ways really to overshoot an economy and cause a recession. And that is one, by keeping rates too high, or number two, by keeping them high for too long. And right now, it looks like they're clearly doing both. However, as we see a lot of this data now coming out, we are starting to see a bit of change in tone from the bank, from Tiff himself, and basically saying we don't need to wait until interest rates are back at 2% before we start raising. We need to see a clear path to 2%. And that path is going to become more and more evident as the economy continues to slow down. And this very much aligns, as we talked about earlier, with the consensus of all the big banks expecting rates to come down mid-2024. And interestingly enough, TD came out with a report recently that projected rates by mid-2025 will hit 2.5%. And as per the Bank of Canada, they've come out with a new forecast saying that inflation may remain in that 3 to 3.5% for 2024, but they see it coming down to 2% by mid 2025. So it looks like the situation that we're in, which is very much induced by interest rates, is going to pass. The question is just really how long and how painful is it going to be between now and then. And a lot of information and statements have been coming out by the Bank of Canada. And one that I found really interesting in terms of its tone was, again, from Tiff McClellan. And what he said was, we have a supply problem at low interest rates. We have a supply problem at high interest rates. Interest rates have a big impact on the housing sector, which is very interest rate sensitive, but we're not going to solve housing shortages with interest rates. And so the problem that we've been experiencing in Toronto real estate has been a supply issue, and it's not going to get resolved, this long-term fundamental systemic issue, through higher interest rates or lower interest rates. It's not really the major fundamental driver of the real underlying issues in the Toronto real estate market. And so when you start to think long-term and you realize that this environment, for however long, is short term, it starts to give you an indication of what prices could start to look like when rates hit a more normal level in the upcoming, 6 months to year, maybe even year and a half. So what's interesting to note is that despite all the negativity that we're hearing in the market, according to the data put out by the Toronto real estate market, year over year, prices are still remaining relatively flat, but that's not really telling the story of what's going on. So this is something that we look at ad nauseum here at Fox Marin, and it's months of inventory. And essentially what months of inventory means is that if nothing were to come on the market today, with the existing inventory at the current rate of sales, how long would it take everything to sell? We are used to operating here in Toronto at extremely low months of inventory, somewhere between 0.85 months and 1.5 months, both for condos and houses, low rise usually being a little bit tighter. At 2 to 4 months, that's considered to be a balanced market. And anything above 4 months, we're getting into buyer's territory. So with condos, we're edging into the high sixes right now in terms of months of inventory for Toronto. And low rise houses are at around 3.5, just heading into 4 months. So we're getting into balanced market territory with low rise, and we clearly now are in a buyer's market on the condo side, and inventory is continuing to pile up. So the few properties that are selling, because we're in a climate right now where we're seeing record low sales for this time of year, they might be doing okay because those are the more desirable properties. But the vast majority of properties on the market, both low rise and condos, are sitting and they're relisting or they're terminating. And so I think we'll continue to see a softening in prices over the next few months as inventory is piling up. And we'll start to see investor resolve in terms of their need to sell and continue to give price breaks. And we'll also see with home sellers how they react in an environment where maybe they're actually looking to sell first rather than buy. And if they can't get the price they want, they might take it off the market. But definitely we're seeing softness and can expect that trend to continue in the near term. And our overall arching thesis right now at Fox Marin is that it's going to get a lot worse on the short term before it gets better. And so if you're in this environment right now and you own a property, it's one of the things we've been telling all of our clients and everyone we've been consulting with. If you don't absolutely have to sell, hang on, hold on for dear life, because in a year from now, we could be in a very different environment. If you are a buyer, and you're going to see some generational opportunities in the next few months. So if you're on the sidelines looking at getting in, I think you're going to start to see some great opportunities coming down the pipes, especially on the condo side. But I think if you can nail down and be specific on the low rise for what you're looking for, you will definitely find some opportunities. And the most important person right now or buyer in the market is a buyer who does not have to sell, who can purchase without selling, and has a large deposit or a large amount to put down, so they aren't feeling the brunt of interest rates, and then they can refinance at a later date when rates do come down. So if you're a buyer or an investor and you don't have to sell and you've got a lot of cash at hand, you essentially are the apex predator of the Toronto real estate market. But when you actually take a look at the current situation, even though there is a lot of inventory on the market and there is continued pressure on pricing and opportunities for buyers that they normally wouldn't have to negotiate or add in conditions, we're still not seeing affordability in the market. So yes, there will be short-term reductions in pricing, but you're not really seeing carrying costs really drop in lieu of that because interest rates are so high. So we're still having a tremendous lack of affordability, and the carrying costs, even though you're purchasing at a lower price, may not really reflect the advantage of purchasing at a lower price point right now. So that is something to really keep in mind. And I think it's really important to understand is that the drop in activity that we're seeing is really just a cyclical reaction to what happened as a result of government stimulus and monetary printing during COVID. And this is really the end of a cycle that we're starting to see or get to move towards. It has nothing to do with an actual fundamental weakness in the Toronto real estate market. One of the things that we're going to see start to play out is a huge stoppage in the building of new homes. And that is going to create maximum pain in the market in terms of supply in the next few years. There was a report that was recently put out by Urbanation specific to new homes, and they said that Toronto developers delayed 14,000 condos coming to market, and they were expecting about 27,000 this year, and only about 13,000 have launched. So this kind of slowdown is going to really wreak havoc on the supply chain of new inventory coming to market, especially in the face of immigration. So the fundamentals of the market still underlying everything remain very, very strong as we go through this very painful high interest rate period. But the real estate market can do really well with the overnight lending rate at around 3 to 4%. I mean, we saw that even back in April and May in the spring, how the market was performing with the overnight lending rate, 50 basis points lower than it is today. So really something to think about when you're trying to get context to what is actually happening in the market. Recent report, a little bit bullish, put out by Desjardins, and they created a base case based on the belief that interest rates will slightly start to come down by mid-2024, which seems to be the consensus. And what they were saying basically in this report is in the face of increasing imbalance in supply between demand caused by huge immigration and low housing starts, they're expecting actually to see prices start to rise next year. And by the end of 2024, we could see prices up by 4% and as much as 5% by the end of 2025. So despite all the negativity that's out there, it's really important to sort of step back, look at what's happening in the market, and think long term. If it's one thing that we've learned over the last, 3 or 4 years, is that it's very hard to predict the future as there are so many moving targets and moving parts swirling around, and it's seemingly everything just keeps moving faster and faster. And there's a lot of forces at play right now that could definitely influence projections for 2024 and into the future. And some of the things, especially happening right now, that I would keep my eye on specific to its impact on the Toronto real estate market would be, number one, on a global scale, is this awful Middle East crisis that's going on right now. And it may have an minimal impact on Canada and the Toronto real estate market. However, if this conflict expands, if Iran gets involved, or if there are incidents that happen that cause oil prices to dramatically spike, that's really going to affect inflation. And these are the type of things that the the Bank of Canada is not expecting. And it could really impact a delay in interest rate cuts if oil prices just suddenly shoot up as a result of some of the turmoil that's going on right now in the Middle East. And that's one of the things that's really important from an investment thesis right now, specific to the Toronto real estate market, is stability is really important. And with a lot of the uncertainty around the inflation narrative or the interest rate narrative, we've seen a lot of uncertainty, and that makes a lot of people defer making a decision and sit on the sidelines. And so if we have this conflict continuing to escalate and we have rates being affected, this uncertainty is definitely going to throw things for a loop, and uncertainty leads to confusion, and confusion oftentimes leads to deferral of making a decision. And if we get to that point with some type of an accelerated massive global conflict, which could happen, it could really impact things here, not just in the Middle East, but in Toronto and in the Toronto real estate market. So that is something to watch, and obviously hope and pray for speedy resolution to this awful situation. Second thing that's really been brought to the forefront right now is we're seeing developers really starting to struggle. And that really shouldn't come as a surprise, because when you had all of these pro formas being made 2, 3, 4 years ago by developers, they were not anticipating an inflation and an interest rate climate like the one that we're in now. And so we've seen the one go bankrupt by Mizrahi, which was a massive development at Yonge and Bloor. It'll be interesting to watch how that one plays out. Another developer just went bankrupt or is in deep financial trouble at the very least, and that's Van Dyke. And Westbank, which is a large, significantly large Vancouver-based developer who has projects here in Toronto, is now in a lot of problems with one of its projects, purpose-built, at the Mirvish Village site at Bathurst and Bloor. So, and all of this has literally come to the foray in the last couple of weeks. And definitely this is something that I would expect more of. over the next couple months as we start to continue to feel the effects of this high interest rate environment. Great quote by Warren Buffett: when the tide goes out, that's when you see who's not wearing a bathing suit. And I think a lot more developers will be exposed for swimming in the nude. So again, that's something to watch because that will also affect the long-term supply chain continuing to be pressured. So something to keep your eye on for sure. And then the other thing to watch is what's happening right now in the US. While it seems like the Bank of Canada is very much over tightening, it seems like the Fed is under tightening. And the reason why that is because in Canada, mortgages don't really extend past 5 years, where in the US, they go out as far as 30 years. If you use what's happening here in Canada, the US should be at least 100 basis points, their overnight lending rate from the Fed, than what we here are in Canada because of the structure of their banking system. And so it seems like they're definitely under tightening. At the same time, they have a tremendous amount of money still flowing through their system. And you've got the Joe Biden administration with a deficit right now of $1.695 trillion, which is a 23% increase from the previous year. And so they, I think, have been flooding the administration economy with money in this environment in the hopes that there will still be a bit of a sugar high as we go into as they go into the U.S. elections next year. And so it seems like that may start to wear off. I mean, we're seeing a contraction in our GDP here in Canada. U.S. showed close to 5% GDP growth. But it seems like as that starts to pass its way through the system and rates take hold, you might start to see a little bit more of a slump in their economy. The last thing really to keep your eye on in 2024 is the U.S. elections. And even though we are in Canada, the old saying goes, when the U.S. sneezes, Canada gets a cold. And so we're very much affected by what happens south of the border. And right now, looking what's happening in the US, it doesn't really seem like there is any good outcome in this upcoming election. And definitely there's going to be a lot of civil strife coming out of the US next year, which may create further uncertainty, which, as we discussed earlier, markets just simply don't like. So lots to keep your eye on. And I'm sure there are a million other things that I haven't mentioned here that could and or will come into play that may affect the market here for better or for worse. But definitely interesting times right now. And I'm glad that everyone who's watching this and has made it to the end was here to join me for this discussion. Please, if you find any of the information that we've talked about here today helpful, please be sure to smash that subscribe button or the like button. And if you have any constructive comments, we'd absolutely love to hear from you. Once again, my name is Ralph Fox, and I am the co-founder and broker of record of Fox Marin. And we hope to hear from you soon.